The average age of a first-time buyer in the UK without any family help has quietly crept past 34, in some parts of the country closer to 37, and that number keeps climbing every single year while wages simply haven't kept pace with the properties buyers are actually trying to purchase. Meanwhile, the buyers who do get on the ladder in their 20s are increasingly doing it with a 5- or 6-figure gift or loan from parents, not from their own independent savings built up entirely on their own. That's not a generational complaint, that's a structural shift in who is actually allowed to buy a home in this country, and it's happening quietly, without a single dramatic headline moment. One mortgage application, one declined offer, one family conversation about a deposit at a time. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through why first-time buyers are being locked out of their own market, the specific mechanisms doing the locking, and what it actually means, practically and financially, to anyone trying to buy without significant family wealth behind them. I've been tracking the UK property market for years, and this is one of those slow-moving structural stories that's easy to miss year to year, but impossible to miss once you compare where things stood a decade ago against where they stand right now. Let's get into it. It's worth pausing on just how recent this shift actually is. Go back roughly a generation, and the standard path into home ownership for someone in a stable job was reasonably predictable. Save for several years while renting modestly, build a deposit through disciplined saving alone, and buy a starter home in your mid to late 20s without family money being a meaningful factor in the calculation for most buyers. That path hasn't vanished entirely, but it's become the exception rather than the rule in a growing number of regions, and the 6 mechanisms below explain exactly why that shift happened, layer by layer, rather than through any single dramatic policy change. The first mechanism is the deposit wall, and it's grown considerably faster than it looks on paper. A 10% deposit on the average UK first-time buyer property now requires tens of thousands of pounds, and in London and the South East, considerably more. That number itself isn't new. Deposits have always required saving. What's changed is the relationship between that deposit requirement and actual take-home pay for someone in their 20s or early 30s without existing housing wealth behind them. Average rents have risen substantially in most major cities over the past several years, which means the exact demographic trying to save a deposit is simultaneously handing over a growing share of their income to a landlord every single month, precisely the money that would otherwise be going toward that deposit. It's a structural trap. Renting delays saving, and saving takes longer specifically because renting costs more, which means the total time to accumulate a deposit has stretched from what used to be a realistic 3 to 5 years into what's now, for a growing number of buyers, a decade or more. Consider a specific example. A buyer earning a solid above-average salary, renting a modest one-bedroom flat in a major city, might reasonably manage to save several £100s a month after covering rent, bills and ordinary living costs. At that pace, reaching a deposit of £30,000 to £40,000 takes the better part of a decade, and that's before accounting for the fact that the property they're saving toward is itself very likely appreciating in value during that same period, meaning the target they're saving toward is, in effect, moving further away even as they save toward it. The second mechanism is the mortgage affordability stress test, tightened considerably in the years following the financial crisis and tightened further again more recently as interest rates rose. Lenders assess not just whether you can afford your mortgage payment at today's rate, but whether you could still afford it if rates rose further, typically several percentage points above whatever you're actually being offered. That's a genuinely sensible piece of prudent regulation in isolation. It exists specifically to prevent a repeat of reckless lending, but it has a real side effect. It disproportionately excludes exactly the buyers with the least existing financial cushion, first-time buyers without family wealth, self-employed applicants with less predictable income histories, and buyers in higher cost of living areas where a larger mortgage is required relative to income even before any stress test is applied. The result is a lending system that, entirely reasonably from a risk management perspective, ends up filtering out precisely the buyers who most need a foothold and rewarding those who already have one, whether through existing housing equity, family deposit assistance, or dual high incomes. There's an important nuance here worth naming directly. Two applicants with an identical gross income can receive meaningfully different mortgage offers depending on factors that have little to do with their actual ability to manage money responsibly, whether their income is salaried or self-employed, how long they've held their current job, whether they have any existing debt, even if it's small and well managed, and which specific lender's particular risk model they happen to apply through. This creates a system where the outcome can feel arbitrary and opaque to individual applicants, even though each lender's internal logic is entirely rational from their own risk perspective.
The third mechanism, and this is the one that's changed the market most dramatically, is the rise of family-assisted buying as the genuine new normal rather than a helpful exception. A significant and growing share of first-time buyer transactions now involve a parental gift or loan toward the deposit, sometimes covering the entire deposit outright. This has quietly restructured the market's underlying dynamics. Sellers and estate agents increasingly price and negotiate assuming a meaningful share of buyers have this kind of backing, because in practice, a growing share of them do. That means the buyer without family wealth isn't just competing against other buyers with similar circumstances to their own. They're competing in a market where a substantial portion of the buyer pool has an entirely different, much faster path to the same deposit, which pushes prices and negotiating dynamics in a direction that increasingly assumes family assistance as the default rather than the exception. Estate agents in competitive first-time buyer markets increasingly describe a specific, uncomfortable dynamic. Two broadly comparable buyers competing for the same property, one able to move quickly with a substantial family-funded deposit and immediate mortgage approval, the other needing more time to finalize financing without that backing, and sellers, entirely rationally from their own perspective, favoring the faster, more certain transaction, regardless of which buyer's own income or long-term financial stability might actually be stronger.
The fourth mechanism is the shrinking supply of genuinely affordable starter homes specifically, as distinct from the broader housing supply conversation. Much of the new build activity over the past decade has concentrated on either high-density city centre apartments aimed at investors and young professionals without children, or larger family homes aimed at buyers who are already moving up the ladder, with genuinely affordable, appropriately sized starter properties, the traditional two-bedroom terrace or entry-level flat outside major cities, built in comparatively limited numbers relative to demand. First-time buyers aren't just competing for a shrinking supply of homes generally, they're competing for a shrinking supply of the specific type of home that actually matches their budget and life stage, while developers have rational commercial reasons to build toward wealthier buyer segments instead. Land costs, construction costs, and the profit margins developers require to satisfy their own shareholders and lenders all push naturally toward higher value, higher margin developments, and a genuinely affordable, modest-sized starter home simply doesn't clear the same margin threshold on an increasingly expensive plot of land as a larger family home or a premium city apartment does. This isn't a moral failing on the part of individual developers so much as a predictable outcome of the underlying economics they're operating within, but the effect on first-time buyers is the same regardless of the underlying cause. The fifth mechanism is the buy-to-let and investor competition that, even as it has eased somewhat in recent years for the reasons this channel has covered before, still shapes which properties first-time buyers are actually competing to buy. In a specific price bracket and property type that first-time buyers target, smaller flats and starter homes, professional landlords and investors have historically been active buyers too, competing for exactly the same stock, often with cash or with mortgage pre-approval that moves faster than a typical first-time buyer chain-free purchase can match. Even a partial retreat of investors from this segment doesn't fully solve the problem, because the segment itself remains structurally undersupplied relative to the number of first-time buyers trying to enter it. There's also a longer-term echo of the landlord exodus worth mentioning here directly, because it cuts in two different directions simultaneously. As small landlords sell up, some of that stock does eventually reach first-time buyers, which is genuinely positive for supply. But a portion of it, as covered in earlier coverage on this channel, is instead being bought in bulk by larger institutional landlords rather than individual owner-occupiers, meaning the net effect on genuine first-time buyer supply is considerably smaller than the headline number of exiting landlords might initially suggest.
The sixth mechanism is Help to Buy's legacy and the gap left behind since it wound down. For years, government schemes specifically targeted at first-time buyers provided an alternative route into homeownership with a smaller deposit, effectively substituting government-backed equity for the family wealth many buyers didn't have. As those schemes have been phased out or scaled back without a comparably scaled replacement arriving to fill the gap, buyers who would previously have used a scheme like this to bridge the deposit gap are increasingly left with exactly two options: accumulate a larger deposit independently over a longer period, or rely on family assistance. For buyers with neither the time to wait nor family wealth available, the practical path to homeownership has narrowed considerably compared to a decade ago. It's worth noting that the schemes which have replaced or partially filled this gap vary considerably by nation and region within the UK. Shared ownership models, regional first home schemes, and various local authority initiatives, but none has arrived with the scale or consistent national visibility that the earlier flagship scheme had, meaning awareness of what's actually still available has become considerably more fragmented, and a meaningful number of eligible buyers simply don't know what support exists in their specific area because there's no longer one obvious national scheme name to search for. Now here's what connects all 6 of these mechanisms, and it's the part that almost nobody explains clearly. None of these forces individually was designed to exclude first-time buyers without family wealth. Prudent mortgage regulation exists to prevent another financial crisis. Developers building toward higher margin properties is a rational commercial response to genuine costs and genuine demand. Parents helping their children onto the property ladder is, on an individual level, simply a loving and sensible use of family resources. But stack all 6 of these individually reasonable forces together, and the cumulative effect is a market where the path to home ownership without family wealth has narrowed dramatically, not through any single deliberate policy choice, but through the compounding interaction of several separate defensible decisions that nobody coordinated and nobody fully anticipated the combined effect of. This is precisely why the story is so difficult to address through any single policy intervention. A government could tighten or loosen mortgage lending rules, adjust one specific support scheme, or incentivize a particular category of house building, and each of those levers would have some genuine effect, but none of them individually addresses the other 5 mechanisms operating simultaneously, which is exactly why first-time buyer affordability has proven such a persistently difficult problem for successive governments to meaningfully solve, despite it being a genuinely popular and frequently stated policy priority across the political spectrum. Here's what nobody puts together properly. This isn't just a story about individual buyers having a harder time. It's quietly reshaping who owns property in this country at a generational level. A cohort of buyers who receive family assistance is building housing equity years earlier than a cohort who didn't, and that earlier start compounds significantly through a working lifetime through capital appreciation on a larger asset held for longer. The buyers without family wealth aren't just delayed, they're accumulating housing wealth on a fundamentally different and slower trajectory than buyers with family backing, and that gap, compounding over decades, is quietly becoming one of the more significant and least discussed sources of wealth inequality within a single generation, separate from and layered on top of the more familiar inequality between older and younger generations that usually dominates this conversation. There's a specific, somewhat uncomfortable dimension to this worth naming directly. It means 2 people who grew up in genuinely similar circumstances, similar schools, similar career trajectories, similar personal financial discipline, can end up on dramatically different housing wealth trajectories purely based on whether their own parents happen to have property equity or savings available to help with the deposit. That's a form of inequality that doesn't map cleanly onto traditional measures like income or education, and it's precisely because it doesn't map onto those familiar categories that it's received comparatively less policy attention than it probably deserves. Here's how this plays out for buyers without family assistance who don't adapt their strategy. They continue trying to save a deposit at the traditional pace while renting in the same expensive markets they eventually want to buy in, watching the gap between their savings rate and the required deposit stay roughly constant or even widen as prices in their target area continue moving faster than their savings. Some giving up on specific desirable areas entirely, others simply extending their timeline year after year without ever quite closing the gap, caught in a cycle where the goalposts move roughly as fast as they're able to run toward them.
Here's how this plays out for buyers who adapt deliberately. They separate the question of where they eventually want to live long-term from where they need to buy first, treating a first purchase in a genuinely more affordable area, sometimes a different city, sometimes a different property type than they'd ideally choose, as a strategic first rung on the ladder, rather than a final destination, building equity there before using that equity to move toward their actual long-term preference later. They explore shared ownership schemes where available and appropriate as a genuine reduced deposit entry route rather than dismissing them out of hand. They actively research whichever first-time buyer support schemes remain available in their specific nation and region, since policy varies meaningfully across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, rather than assuming national headlines about scheme closures necessarily apply to their exact local situation. And where family assistance is genuinely available, they treat the conversation about it as a serious financial planning discussion, potential deed of trust arrangements, clarity about whether it's a gift or a loan, rather than an awkward topic to avoid discussing properly. Some also look seriously at joint purchases with a sibling or a close friend, a less common route but an increasingly discussed one, structured properly through a formal deed of trust that clearly sets out each party's financial contribution and share, precisely to avoid the kind of ambiguity that can otherwise turn a practical financial arrangement into a personal relationship problem years down the line. None of these adaptations is universally right for every buyer's specific circumstances, but the buyers who fare best in this market are consistently the ones who've actively explored every route available to them, rather than defaulting to the single most conventional path and simply waiting for their circumstances to eventually match it.
Here's how this plays out at the market level over the next several years. Expect the average first-time buyer age to continue climbing gradually rather than reversing, because the underlying structural mechanisms described throughout this video haven't meaningfully changed direction. Expect family-assisted buying to become even more deeply embedded as the market's working assumption, further widening the practical gap between buyers with and without that backing. Expect continued policy debate and periodic new scheme announcements aimed at first-time buyers, but expect any individual scheme to address only one piece of a six-part structural puzzle, meaning genuine, comprehensive improvement for buyers without family wealth is likely to remain slow and partial rather than sudden and complete. And expect the generational wealth divide within younger cohorts themselves, between those with family backing and those without, to become an increasingly visible and increasingly discussed feature of the UK housing conversation over the coming years, as more people quietly notice the divergence happening among their own peer group rather than simply between their generation and their parents. There's a further dimension worth watching specifically among younger buyers themselves. As awareness of this divide grows, expect more open, less taboo discussion within families about exactly what assistance is realistically available and when, replacing what has historically been a somewhat awkward, unspoken topic with clearer, earlier conversations simply because the financial stakes of leaving that conversation until the last minute have become too significant for many families to comfortably ignore any longer.
If you're trying to buy without significant family wealth behind you, the most useful thing you can do isn't waiting for the market to become easier, because nothing in the structural picture described here suggests it will on its own. It's being deliberate and strategic about exactly where and how you make your first purchase, treating it as the first move in a longer game rather than expecting to land immediately in your ideal property in your ideal location. Research every regional and national first-time buyer scheme still available to you specifically, not just the ones making national headlines. And if family assistance is available to you in any form, treat that conversation with the seriousness and clarity it deserves, because in the current market, the difference between having that assistance and not having it has become one of the single largest determinants of how quickly, and sometimes whether, someone gets to own a home at all. It's also worth being honest that none of these strategies fully erases the underlying structural gap this video has described. Adapting your approach improves your odds meaningfully within the market as it currently exists, but it doesn't change the fact that the market itself has shifted in ways that make the path harder than it was for previous generations at the same age, regardless of how strategically any individual buyer navigates it. The UK property ladder was never designed to require family wealth as a prerequisite for the first rung. It simply drifted there, gradually, through the accumulation of 6 individually reasonable forces that nobody coordinated and nobody fully intended. Understanding that it's a structural shift, not a personal failing, is the first step. Adapting your own strategy around that reality rather than waiting for it to reverse on its own is the second, and for most buyers without family wealth behind them right now, given everything described across these 6 mechanisms, it's the only step that's actually within their control. And recognizing that distinction between the parts of this situation you can influence through your own strategy and the parts that reflect a genuinely changed market you didn't create matters for reasons well beyond property alone. It's the difference between a productive plan and a frustrating ongoing sense of falling behind for reasons that were never really about personal effort in the first place.